This is the audio for Chapter 11 of Chasing Lincoln's Killer. On the night of April 22nd, after another night's delay, John Wilkes Booth and David Herold finally climbed aboard the boat and rowed out into the Potomac towards Virginia. This time they steered the correct course and, after several hours, spotted their destination, the mouth of the creek of the Virginia side of the Potomac. They landed and disembarked. At last, on April 23rd, 9 days after the assassination, John Wilkes Booth and David Herold set foot on Virginia soil. Their contact, a former Confederate agent, Mrs. Quisenberry, had a place about half an hour away on foot. Booth's injured leg made the brief walk impossible for him, so Herold went alone to find the woman. Elizabeth Quisenberry, an ex-Confederate spy, was cautious when Herold approached her. Experience during the war had taught her to be suspicious of strangers, especially those who looked like Herold. Herold revealed that Thomas Jones had sent them to her, which put her mind at ease. Herold revealed the nature of his request for help. He was traveling with an injured companion. They needed horses to make their way south. Suspecting or already knowing who the two strangers were, Mrs. Quisenberry decided that this was too big a job to handle by herself. With the help of other loyal operatives, she arranged for horses. She would get the two moving south as quickly as possible. Speed was now of the essence. Mrs. Quisenberry arranged for horses and food, which Herold brought to the waiting Booth. After eating, they saddled up. Mr. Richard Stewart's house was the next stop on their journey. To their dismay, the doctor refused to help them. Herold pleaded their case, mentioning their Confederate credentials and recommendation from Dr. Mudd. Stewart, unconvinced and suspicious of the elaborate and ridiculous cover story Herold spun for him, reluctantly offered to feed them. After eating, they would have to be on their way. Dr. Stewart was a great disappointment, failing to display the Southern hospitality and honor that Booth had come to expect. Booth and Herold sat down to dinner with Stewart and his family. How out of place these dirty, tired travelers must have seemed at the Stewart's fine table. But Booth's filthy clothes, unshaven face, and pungent body could not conceal his obvious good breeding. His excellent manners, educated voice, and physical poise marked him as a gentleman. By now, Dr. Stewart knew exactly who his visitors were. They were dirty, desperate, and on the run. And one had a broken leg. They fit the profile of the men now known to the whole country as Lincoln's assassins. After dinner, Stewart practically ordered Booth and Herold to leave his home, which they did without protest. Later, Booth would write a letter to Dr. Stewart, chiding him for his lack of Southern hospitality and honor. As an insult, Booth enclosed a small sum of money as a payment for the meal they had eaten, but not enjoyed, at Stewart's. Denied a bed and hospitality for the night, Booth and Herold continued to search for transportation at the house of one of Stewart's neighbors, a man of color named Lucas. Lucas, too, was reluctant to help the strangers. Under protest, he finally agreed to rent them a team of horses and a wagon, with his son Charlie acting as a driver for the trip south. It took threats of violence by Booth to persuade Lucas to allow the fugitives to stay the night at his cabin. In the morning, Booth paid $20 for the use of the wagon, the team, and driver. When they arrived at their destination, Port Conway, young Charlie Lucas stopped the wagon in front of the home of William Rollins, a farmer and a fisherman. There Booth and Herold quenched their thirst and sought a ride south across the Rappahannock River to Port Royal, then on to a nearby railroad station. The tide was rising and the fisherman was eager to prepare for the day's catch. He agreed to ferry Booth and Herold across the river as soon as he set his fishing nets. At that moment, 3 mounted figures appeared on the hill just above Port Conway. They were soldiers, and the wagon driven by Charlie Lucas parked in front of William Rollins' house caught their attention. The men spurred their horses and descended into town. Booth and Herold tensed for action. An encounter with the soldiers was inevitable. Herold walked towards the riders as they approached, creating distance between them and Booth. The jackets and soldiers were not blue of the Union soldiers. A few casual questions, and Herold determined that they were Confederates. These were soldiers likely to be sympathetic to their plight. Herold gave the soldiers false names and claimed he and Booth were on their way to join up with the Confederates himself. He pretended he was an enthusiastic militant Confederate, eager to continue to fight for the war, whatever it was. One of the soldiers, Willie Jett, reacted skeptically to Herold's story. He asked a simple question: "Who are you?" Herold replied, his voice trembling, "We are the assassinators of the president. Yonder is J. Wilkes Booth, the man who killed the president." Jett told the other two soldiers, Ruggles and Bainbridge, the exciting news he had just learned. When Rollins returned from setting his nets, he asked Booth if he was ready to be ferried across the river now. The soldiers huddled in the fugitives and hatched a plan. They would accompany the assassins in the ferry boat and help them on the other side. To the man who piloted the men across the river, the strangers were unremarkable, just another band of bedraggled rebels heading home after losing the war. The successful crossing represented a high point of this phase of the escape. After many disappointments, they had crossed safely south and found loyal Confederate comrades. Overcome with emotion, Booth shouted out, "I'm safe in glorious old Virginia, thank God." Willie Jett, Ruggles, Bainbridge, and the fugitives made their way to Locust Hill, a farm owned by Richard H. Garrett, seeking shelter for the night. Willie introduced himself and presented Booth. "Here is a wounded Confederate soldier that we want you to take care of for a day or so. Will you do it?" Garrett thought of his sons who had returned from the war safely just a few days ago. He would return the blessing with his kindness. He agreed to take them in. The soldiers took Herold with them on a ride into the nearby town while Booth spent the night of April 24th at Garrett's farm. Booth spun an unbelievable tale for the Garretts. He had been wounded in battle and was now being chased by the Union cavalry. Until now, most of the investigation and manhunts were focused on southern Maryland. That was about to change. Lafayette Baker, the notorious detective and War Department agent, and a favorite of Stanton's, had been in Washington since April 16th. Since his arrival, his deceitfulness, egotistical, and self-promoting ways had rubbed a number of the manhunters the wrong way. He had tried to seal other detectives' leads. He was snooping around the telegraph office when the message came in. 2 men had been crossing the Potomac. This report required action. Lafayette Baker seized the telegram, rushed back to the headquarters, and alerted his cousin, Luther Bryan Baker, to the news of the sighting. Lafayette said, "I think Booth has crossed the river, and I want you to go right out." Yes, 2 men had been crossing the river on April 16th, but they were not Booth and Herold. A telegraphed order to the commander of the 16th New York Cavalry ordered a commissioned officer, Lieutenant Edward P. Dowdery, to report to Luther Bryan Baker. Baker handed him freshly painted photographs of 3 men. Doherty's did not recognize 2 of them, but the 3rd man was John Wilkes Booth. He was going after Lincoln's assassin. While Colonel Baker stayed behind in Washington to monitor telegraph traffic and protect his interests in the reward money, Edward Dowdery, Luther Baker, and Everton Conger made their way across the water by steamboat, landing in Virginia. From there, the troops traveled south overland on horseback. If they kept moving, the soldiers of the 16th New York would reach the same spot where the fugitives had crossed the Rappahannock by tomorrow afternoon, April 25th. That evening, John Wilkes Booth enjoyed a leisurely supper with the Garretts. He relished the company of the genuine hospitality, so different from Dr. Stewart's impolite, hostile reception. Herold rode into the nearby town of Bowling Green with the Confederates to purchase, of all things, a new pair of shoes. He would spend the night with them and rejoin Booth tomorrow, April 25th, at Garrett's farm. Booth would sleep in a real bed tonight. It had been days since he had slept in a proper bed, and this was the first night since the assassination that Booth and Herold spent apart. Nearby, the cavalry divided their forces. One column was commanded by Everton Conger, one by Edward Doherty. They searched farmhouses and barns, questioned the occupants, making their way south to Port Conway. Booth's head start over the manhunters began to shrink. It had taken Booth 10 days to travel from Washington to Port Conway ferry. It would take the cavalry, alerted by telegraph and traveling by steamboat, just 1 day to travel that distance. On Monday, April 24th, Dr. Samuel A. Mudd saw soldiers, too. They had come to his farm to arrest him and take him to the old Capitol prison. Confined and isolated, Mudd would wait to learn what price he would have to pay for his part in hiding Lincoln's assassins. The morning of April 25th, Booth slept in. He talked and played with the Garrett's children. He showed them his pocket compass, delighted them by making the needle dance when he held the point of his pocket knife above it. Early in the afternoon, the Garretts and Booth sat at the dinner table. Young John Garrett, back from an errand at the neighboring farm, reported that the U.S. government was offering a $140,000 reward for Abraham Lincoln's assassin. The family discussed the assassination with Booth, speculating on why the murderer did it. The actor, still masquerading as a Confederate soldier, commented on his own crime and analyzed for the Garretts the motives of Lincoln's killer. Booth needed rest and would happily have spent a month with the Garretts recovering from his injury and regaining his strength. But it was time to move on. He asked for a map of Virginia. He said he would make his way to the town of Orange Court House, where he hoped to get a horse. He would ride south to join a Confederate army still in the field. Booth should have left hours ago. He was too far north, within striking distance of Union troops. Booth came out onto the porch. He became agitated when he saw riders moving past the farm's front gate. To his obvious relief, the men just rode by. The danger was over for the moment, but Richard Garrett was alarmed by Booth's reaction to the riders. 5 minutes later, a lone man walked up the road to the farm. Booth asked 11-year-old Richard Jr. to run and fetch his pistols and gun belt from his room upstairs. The Garretts expected a gun battle to break out in their yard at any moment, but Booth did not draw his pistols. It was David Herold returning from his overnight stay a few miles south. To David Herold's dismay, Booth intended to spend another night at the farm. He would ask for the Garretts for another night of hospitality for him and for Herold. With his father temporarily away from the farm on business, it fell to son John to decide whether to take them in or not. To their surprise, John Garrett refused to take them in for the night. Booth's panic at the sight of this rider was a tip-off. Something was not right. John Garrett was suspicious of Booth now. The 16th New York Cavalry rode into Port Conway on Tuesday, April 25th, late in the afternoon. Luther Baker spotted William Rollins, the man who had offered to ferry Booth, Herold, Jett, Ruggles, and Bainbridge to Port Royal. For questioning Rollins, Baker discovered that a man with a broken leg had crossed the river the day before around noon. It must be Booth. That meant the fugitives were only about a day's ride ahead of them. Baker learned something else that interested him. Booth was now in the company of Confederate soldiers. That could add to the danger of the mission to capture Booth. Rollins then identified photographs of Herold and Booth. Rollins and his wife also identified the 3 rebel soldiers, Willie, Jett, Ruggles, and Bainbridge. In a stroke of luck, they also had an idea where Willie Jett might be headed. Jett had been courting a young lady whose father kept a hotel in the nearby town of Bowling Green. The soldiers' next destination was clear: cross the Rappahannock, then on to look for Jett. It was 4 p.m. on Tuesday, April 25th. John Garrett worried about what to do with his now unwanted guests. Soon, 2 horsemen riding quickly from the direction of Port Royal galloped towards the house at high speed. Booth and Herold left from the front porch to meet them. Ruggles and Bainbridge hurried to bring the news. The Union cavalry was coming. The Confederates had seen the patrol crossing the Rappahannock on a ferry. Worse news, the patrol had seen the Confederates watching them from the ridge overlooking the ferry. Bainbridge and Ruggles turned their horses around and galloped away, headed away from where they had seen the patrol. Booth and Herold looked at each other and, without exchanging a single word, ran for the woods behind the Garrett's barn and waited. No cavalry arrived. If Booth's agitation about the riders worried Garrett, his flight into the woods with Herold frightened him even more. John Garrett complained forcefully, asking them to leave the house. While he argued with them, a thunderous sound shook the earth. "There goes the cavalry now," Garrett exclaimed. It was Union soldiers, but, incredibly, they rode right past the front gate and raced on towards Bowling Green in pursuit of Willie Jett. John Garrett, certain Herold knew the patrol's purpose, asked them again to leave at once. Once again, Booth and Herold needed transportation. Where could they find horses or hire a team and a wagon? Garrett agreed to help them, taking them where they wanted to go himself if necessary. To his dismay, Booth and Herold said they did not want to leave until morning. The mood at the dinner table that night differed from the friendly atmosphere the night before. The reluctant host talked no more of the Lincoln's assassination. After supper, the fugitives again discussed where they might find transportation, probably horses. The Civil War had consumed most of the good horses in the South. They were scarce and valuable. John Garrett grew increasingly suspicious of the strangers. Did they intend to steal horses from the Garretts? Booth and Herold sat on the front porch, watching the evening sky's last clouds of colors fade to black. The scent of the spring night filled their nostrils until the sweetly burning smoke rising from Booth's pipe flavored the air. The reluctant Garretts had nourished and sustained Booth for another day. Tomorrow morning, Wednesday, April 26th, he would continue his journey south. It would be the 12th day. But first, they would rest another night. They planned to spend the night in the bed Garrett had offered Booth that night before. John Garrett stunned the two by barking out that they could not sleep in the house. Could they sleep under the house then? Impossible, said Garrett. The dogs sleep there, and they would bite them. Herold put the matter at rest, announcing they would sleep in the tobacco barn then. John Garrett still did not know the identity of the man he was throwing out of his house. He was pretty sure the two were in some kind of trouble, but it was unlikely he knew it was Lincoln's killer, who was a guest at his family's dinner table. Booth and Herold headed towards the tobacco barn, which stood 100 feet or so from the main house. It was 48 feet by 50 feet, with a slanted roof and a wide, open slats in the walls. By 9 p.m., Booth and Herold had unrolled their blankets and settled in for the night. They were unaware that the Garretts, already guilty of inhospitality, were conspiring to commit a worse offense, treachery. Lincoln's assassin had just walked into a trap. The Garretts swung the barn door shut behind the fugitives. Neither Booth nor Herold paid attention to the black iron lock on the door as they passed through the doorway. John Garrett was sure the men were scheming to steal their horses in the middle of the night. What better way to prevent them than by locking the strangers into the tobacco shed until morning? His brother William tiptoed to the front door and, as quietly as he could, inserted the key into the lock. The fugitives did not hear the sliding bolt, did not know they were prisoners. Then brothers John and William Garrett grabbed blankets and pistols and spent the night in the cornhouse watching the tobacco barn and waiting, listening for suspicious sounds in the night. At 11 p.m., the cavalry patrol approached Bowling Green. They surrounded the Star Hotel, expecting to find Willie Jett inside. The proprietor of the house led the soldiers to a second-story bedroom. Prepared for anything, the officer and detectives rushed in and discovered Willie. They seized him, hustled him downstairs roughly, and confined him in the parlor. Doherty, Baker, and Conger worked on Jett, trying to frighten him. Conger asked, "Where are the two men who came with you across the river at Port Royal?" Jett betrayed John Wilkes Booth. "I know who you want, and I will tell you where they can be found." He revealed the fugitives were at Richard Garrett's farmhouse and agreed to show the soldiers where they were. Without Jett's help, it might have been difficult, almost impossible, to locate the Garrett's farm in the middle of the night. It was day 12. At about 12:30 a.m., the 16th New York Cavalry headed for Garrett's farm, and, they hoped, the capture of Lincoln's assassin. Once at the front gate of the Garrett's farm, a charge was ordered. The 16th New York Cavalry raced up the dirt road towards the farmhouse. The Garrett's dog heard the noises first, the sound of the metal touching metal, and 100 hoofs sending vibrations through the earth. On watch, John and William Garrett heard it too. The barking of the dogs and clanking metal sounds finally woke Booth. Realizing the unique music of the cavalry on the move, the assassin knew he had only a minute or two to react before it was too late. "The cavalry is here," Booth hissed as he woke Herold. They snatched up their weapons and rushed to the front of the barn, where they discovered the door was locked. The Garretts had imprisoned them. Booth tried to pry the lock from its mountings. They had to flee immediately before the Union troops could surround them. They scampered to the back wall of the barn and tried to kick out a board so they could crawl out. With Booth's injured leg, even working together, he and Herold could not dislodge a board, so they could not escape into the woods. The Union column raced up the road and surrounded the farmhouse. Edward Doughty, Luther Baker, and Everton Conger dropped from their saddles, leaped up onto the porch, and pounded on the door. Richard Garrett climbed from his bed and walked downstairs in his nightclothes. In the tobacco barn, David Herold panicked. "You had better give up," he urged. No, the actor insisted. "I will suffer death first." Conger demanded of Richard Garrett, "Where are the two men who stopped here at your house?" Garrett turned out to be very reluctant to reveal Booth and Herold's whereabouts. Even the threat of hanging did not move Richard Garrett to reveal where the prey were hiding. Then Doughty seized John Garrett and put a revolver to his head, ordering him to tell him where the assassins were. "In the barn," he slowly revealed. "They're in the tobacco barn." The soldiers rushed to surround the barn. Baker ordered John Garrett to enter the barn and take the weapons from the fugitives. John had seen Booth's weapons and knew they would not hesitate to take revenge for his family's inhospitality and betrayal. No, he would not be the assassin's last victim. Baker explained that the mission was not optional. If he did not go in the barn, Baker would burn all of the Garrett's property. He would end this affair with a bonfire and shooting match. Baker unlocked the barn door, opened it a little, with Booth invisible just a few yards away. He clutched his pistol tightly, but held his fire. Baker seized John Garrett and, half guided, half pushed him through the door and closed it behind him. John Garrett urged Booth, still hiding in the dark, to give himself up. Like a ghostly vision, John Wilkes Booth's pale, haunting face emerged from darkness as his voice imploded. "Damn you! You have betrayed me! If you don't get me out of here, I will shoot you! Get out of this barn at once!" The assassin reached behind the back for one of his revolvers. A terrified John Garrett turned and ran, escaping the barn. Finally, at the climax of a 12-day manhunt that had gripped the nation, a heavily armed patrol of the 16th New York Cavalry had cornered Lincoln's assassin. Surprisingly, instead of ordering their men to rush the barn and take Booth, they first sent an unarmed civilian to disarm him. When the scheme failed, they attempted to talk him out of the barn. Why didn't 26 armed soldiers, under cloak and darkness, charge 2 civilians hiding in a barn? Surely the honor of capturing Lincoln's assassin was worth the risk of a few casualties. Baker shouted an ultimatum to the fugitives. "I want you to surrender. If you don't, I will burn this barn down in 15 minutes. Booth stepped to the front of the barn and peered through the space between 2 boards, examining the manhunters. "Who are you? What do you want? Whom do you want?" "We want you," Baker replied, "and we know who you are. Give up your arms and come out." Booth continued to stall, asking for more time to make a decision. Baker agreed to the delay. Herold decided to give himself up. He thought he could talk his way out of trouble and just go home. In his mind, he wasn't guilty of anything. Booth had shot Lincoln, Powell had stabbed Stewart, and he had just been along for the ride. Booth, however, refused to let Herold go. Herold pleaded, and Booth begging to be released. Finally, Booth relented, denouncing his companion. "You damned coward, go! Go!" Herold had stood by Booth, even when he had a chance to leave. He had rendered loyal service, and it was harsh to call him a coward now. Herold turned away from Booth and faced the door. He thrust one empty hand at a time through the door frame where the soldiers could see them. Doughty sprung to the door, seized Herold by the wrist, and yanked him through the doorway. He frisked him to make sure he was unarmed, and, like a schoolmaster taking a disobedient student by the collar, marched him away from the barn. Now there remained only John Wilkes Booth, still at bay and armed. For Booth, this was his final and greatest performance. not just for the small audience of soldiers at the Garrett's barn, but also for history. He had already committed the most daring public murder in American history, and he had performed it, fully staged before an audience at Ford's Theater. Tonight, he would script his own end with a performance that equaled his triumph at Ford's. Baker and Conger argued against waiting until morning to take Booth. In a few hours, the light of dawn would illuminate the manhunters and make them into perfect, visible targets. Booth could hardly miss. One of Dougherty's sergeants, Boston Corbett, volunteered for a suicide mission. He would slip into the barn alone and fight Booth one-on-one. 3 times Corbett volunteered. Each time Dougherty ordered Corbett back into his position. Conger and Baker had another plan. They wanted to burn the barn. The flames and smoke would do the job of flushing Booth out without harm to the men. Conger ordered that Garrett's sons to collect a few armful of straws and pile them against the side of the barn. The rustling sounds alerted Booth, who rushed to the side of the noise. He ordered the Garretts to move away from the barn, or he would shoot them. They quickly retreated out of the pistol's range. Anticipating the barn was about to be burned down, Booth challenged all the pursuers to an honorable combat on open ground. He had just challenged 26 men, a lieutenant, and 2 detectives to a duel. Baker declined this offer. "Well, my brave boys, prepare a stretcher for me," Booth replied merrily. Conger bent over and lit the kindling. The pine twigs and straw burst into flames that licked the dry, weathered boards. Soon the barn caught fire, and within minutes the corners of the barn blazed brightly. The fire cast a yellow-orange glow that flickered eerily across the faces of the soldiers. Booth could see them clearly now, but held his fire. As the fire grew, it lit inside of the barn, so for the first time the soldiers could also see their quarry in the gaps between the slats. The assassin had 3 choices: stay in the barn and burn alive, blow his brains out, or script his own honorable end by hobbling out of the front door and doing battle with the manhunters, welcoming death by risking capture. Booth decided it was better to die than to be taken back to Washington to face justice. He did not wish to bear the spectacle of the trial that would put him out on public display for the amusement of the press and curiosity of seekers. Nor did he wish to endure the rituals of hanging, being bound and blindfolded, parading past his own coffin and open grave, climbing the steps of the scaffold. The shameful death of the common criminal was not for him. It was far better to perish here. Booth stood in the center of the barn, awkwardly, balancing his carbine in one hand and a pistol in the other, and a crutch under his other arm. Measuring how quickly the flames were engulfing him, he hopped forward, the carbine in his right hand, the butt plate balanced against his hip. Outside the barn, Conger, Baker, Dougherty, and the cavalrymen tensed for action. No one could endure the hot flames and choking smoke for long. They expected the door to swing open at any moment and see Booth emerge with his hands up or his pistol blaring. Boston Corbett watched the assassin's every move inside the barn. Unseen by Booth, he walked up to one side of the barn and peeked between one of the gaps in the barn walls. As the flames grew brighter, Corbett could see the prey clearly. The sergeant watched Booth and drew his pistol. Booth leveled his carbine against his hip as though preparing to bring it into firing position. Corbett poked the barrel of the revolver through the slit in the wall, aimed at Booth, and fired. The soldiers heard one shot. Instantly, Booth dropped the carbine and crumpled to his knees. Like sprinters cued by a starting gun, Baker rushed into the barn and Conger at his heels. Conger seized the assassin's pistol. They lifted Booth from the floor, carried him under the trees a few yards from the door, and laid him on the grass. Though unable to move, Booth opened his eyes and attempted to speak. Conger called for water, poured a little into Booth's mouth, and he spit it out. The assassin could not swallow. He was completely paralyzed. For the first time in his life, the great actor was at a loss for words. His voice was silenced by the bullet that had quickly passed through his neck and spinal column. After several attempts at speaking, Booth whispered, "Tell mother, I die for my country." It was hard to hear this faint voice above the roar of the fire, the shouts of the men, and the snorting of the horses. As the blaze in the barn grew into an inferno, the soldiers retreated to the Garrett's house, moving Booth's limp body onto the porch near the bench where Booth sat, smoked, napped, and chatted over the previous 2 days. Blood seeped from the entry and exit wounds in his neck and pooled under his head, staining the floorboards. Doherty brought David Herold to the porch, bound his hands, and tied him to a tree about 2 yards from where Booth lay. Herold would have a front row seat for the climax of the chase of Lincoln's killers. Booth suffered an extreme pain whenever he was moved. "Kill me," he begged the soldiers. "Kill me, kill me." "We don't want to kill you," Conger reassured him. "We want you to get well." He was sincere. They wanted Booth alive so they could bring him back to Washington as a prize for Edward Stanton. Stanton and the others were certain Booth was merely an agent of a Confederate conspiracy. Following the swearing in of Andrew Johnson as the 17th president, Stanton had issued a reward for Jefferson Davis and other Confederate officials, naming them as assassination conspirators. 2 others captured conspirators, Michael O'Laughlin and Sam Arnold, had already confessed everything they knew about the plot. If Booth talked too, he might reveal valuable information that implicated the highest officials in the Confederacy. But because of someone under Conger's command, it was obvious Booth was not going back to Washington alive. Who fired that shot? Conger demanded to know. Boston Corbett came forward, snapped to attention, saluted Conger, and proclaimed that he had shot Booth, and Providence had directed him to do so. He claimed he opened fire because he thought Booth was going to shoot the soldiers. He did it to protect the lives of his fellow troopers. In fact, the men of the 16th New York had not been ordered to hold their fire. Conger, Baker, and Doherty had failed to give them any orders at all on that subject. As a non-commissioned officer, Corbett exercised his own discretion and shot Booth. A local doctor was summoned. He explained Booth, who lapsed in and out of consciousness. He examined Booth, who lapsed in and out of consciousness. He proclaimed the wound was mortal. Booth would not recover. Conger rifled through Booth's pockets and then placed the contents into a handkerchief. Booth's diary, money, keys, compass, small knife, and tobacco would be taken to Stanton as treasure and evidence. "My hands," Booth whispered. Baker raised them for Booth to see. For the last time, John Wilkes Booth saw the hands, now helpless, that slain Abraham Lincoln. Gathering his remaining strength, he looked up his hands and spoke his last words. "Useless. Useless." Booth's lips turned purple and his throat swelled. He gasped. The rising sun nudged above the horizon and colored the eastern sky, flooding the Garrett's farm with light which shone on Booth's face. The stage grew dark for him. His body shuddered. John Wilkes Booth was dead. The 12-day chase for Abraham Lincoln's assassin was over.